The year was 1955, a time when America's Deep South was still steeped in the harsh grip of segregation. In the small town of Montgomery, Alabama, where unspoken rules dictated who could love whom, Daniel Carter had learned that survival meant keeping his head down. As a skilled mechanic, he had grown up in his uncle's auto shop, working with grease-stained hands, fixing engines, and navigating the quiet dangers of being a black man in a world where stepping out of line could mean losing everything. But then, one fateful evening changed everything. The smoky warmth of Rosie's Jazz Club was one of the few places where color blurred, if only for a few hours, under dim golden lights and the defiant rhythm of the saxophone. Daniel didn't frequent such places often, too risky, too many eyes watching. But that night, as he stood in the corner, listening to the low hum of a trumpet solo, his gaze caught someone across the room. Eleanor Whitmore. She was a vision of elegance in a pale blue dress, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her face, her bright hazel eyes holding a quiet kind of sorrow. Daniel knew exactly who she was, the daughter of Richard Whitmore, one of the wealthiest and most ruthless men in town. A man who believed in power, control, and keeping people like Daniel in their place. And yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. Their eyes met. A spark ignited. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, as if they had been waiting their whole lives to find each other. And despite everything, the danger, the unwritten laws, the whispers of people around them, Eleanor smiled. It was a mistake, a foolish, reckless, beautiful mistake. But from that moment on, neither of them could turn away. Their meetings started in shadows, in stolen moments beneath moonlit porches, whispered conversations in alleyways where no one would see. Eleanor wasn't like her father. She didn't believe in hate, in division, in a world where love was dictated by the color of one's skin. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, allowed himself to dream of something impossible. But dreams, in a world like theirs, were dangerous. And someone was watching. The warning came swiftly. One evening, as Daniel locked up the garage, a shadow loomed behind him. He barely had time to turn before a harsh voice cut through the air. "Stay away from my daughter." Richard Whitmore stood there, his face cold as stone, his gaze filled with the weight of generations of power. And behind him, two men, silent, unmoving, their presence a quiet threat. Daniel's fists clenched. He wasn't a man who scared easily. But this was something else. Whitmore didn't need to raise his voice. His wealth, his influence, his sheer presence spoke for him. And in that moment, Daniel understood what he was truly up against. "I won't tell you again." And then, just like that, they were gone. That night, Daniel barely slept. He knew what men like Whitmore were capable of. He had seen it before. Men disappearing, accidents that weren't accidents, rumors of bodies found in the river. And yet, the thought of walking away from Eleanor felt more unbearable than any threat her father could make. Then, as dawn broke, he found something under the door of the shop, a small, crumpled note. "Meet me. Midnight. The old bridge." His pulse quickened. He knew who it was from. When the time came, he found Eleanor waiting for him, her hands trembling but her eyes fierce. "My father won't stop," she whispered. "He'll never let me go." Daniel reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers. "Then we run." It was the only choice left. But they both knew, leaving Montgomery wouldn't just mean escaping her father. It meant leaving everything behind. Their families, their pasts, their very identities. And once they left, there was no coming back. The night air was thick with summer heat as Daniel and Eleanor slipped through the back streets of Montgomery, hearts pounding with every step. Every shadow felt like a watchful eye, every distant voice a threat. They had nothing but a small satchel of clothes and a few dollars tucked into Eleanor's dress. Daniel had managed to bribe a railway worker, an old friend of his uncle's, to let them hide inside a freight train bound for Chicago. The train station was eerily quiet, the tracks stretching out like an unspoken promise of freedom. As they crept toward the cargo hold, Eleanor reached for Daniel's hand. "Are you scared?" she asked. He looked at her, at the woman who had given up her entire world to be by his side, and squeezed her fingers tightly. "Not as long as I'm with you." A low whistle sounded in the distance, the signal. They moved quickly, climbing into the darkened carriage, ducking behind wooden crates as the train jolted forward. Then came the waiting. Hours passed. The rhythmic clatter of the train tracks was the only sound. Eleanor rested against Daniel's shoulder, exhausted but unwilling to sleep. "Tell me we'll make it," she murmured. Daniel pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "We'll make it." But danger was never far behind. As dawn crept over the horizon, Daniel heard something, footsteps, then voices. The door to the cargo hold creaked open, and harsh light flooded in. "What do we have here?" Two men stood at the entrance, their uniforms unmistakable, railway guards. Daniel's breath caught. If they were caught now, it was over. They would be arrested, sent back, or worse. One of the guards stepped forward, squinting in the dim light. His eyes landed on Eleanor's face. His brow furrowed. "Miss Whitmore?" Daniel felt Eleanor's grip tighten on his arm. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to Daniel's utter shock, the other guard reached out and pulled his partner back. "Let them be." The first guard hesitated but said nothing. Then, without another word, they pulled the door shut, plunging them back into darkness. Eleanor's breathing was ragged. Why did he? Daniel shook his head. He didn't know. But one thing was certain. Someone had just given them a second chance. And as the train rumbled on toward Chicago, toward an uncertain future, Daniel held Eleanor close and whispered a silent vow. They would make it, no matter what it took. The train screeched as it slowed to a halt, the sharp hiss of steam filling the air. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue over the vast rail yard of Chicago's Union Station. Daniel and Eleanor remained hidden in the shadows, hearts pounding as they listened for approaching footsteps. No guards. No one looking for them. They had made it. The city was unlike anything Eleanor had ever seen. Skyscrapers stretched toward the sky, and the streets bustled with life. Factory workers, street vendors, children in worn-out shoes darting between cars. The air smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread from the corner bakeries. It was loud, chaotic, and freeing. But freedom came at a cost. With only a few dollars to their names, they had nowhere to go. Daniel had a distant cousin, Marcus, who had come to Chicago years ago to escape the South. If they could find him, they might have a chance. They walked for hours, asking for directions, dodging suspicious glances. Eleanor, with her pale skin and delicate features, drew attention. A white woman with a black man. It was still dangerous, even here. Finally, they found Marcus. He lived in a cramped apartment above a tailor's shop in Bronzeville, the heart of Chicago's black community. When he opened the door and saw Daniel standing there, a man he hadn't seen in years, standing beside a white woman with desperation in his eyes, Marcus didn't ask questions. He let them in. Life in Chicago was far from easy. Daniel found work in a factory, laboring long hours for barely enough pay to keep food on the table. Eleanor, once accustomed to fine dresses and elegant dinners, now scrubbed floors in a boarding house to earn a few cents. But they had each other, and that was enough. Most nights, they came home exhausted, their bodies aching, but their spirits unbroken. Eleanor learned to cook simple meals with the little they could afford. Daniel worked late, coming home with grease-stained hands and a weary smile. They were building a life together, brick by brick, against all odds. But trouble was never far behind. One evening, as Daniel walked home, he felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. He turned a corner and froze. A man leaned against a lamppost, smoking a cigarette, one of Richard Whitmore's men. Fear coiled in Daniel's stomach. He knew this moment would come. The man smirked, exhaling a long trail of smoke. "Your little game is over, Carter." Daniel's fists clenched. "She's not going back." The man chuckled darkly. "That ain't up to you." Then, he reached into his coat. Daniel didn't wait. He turned and ran, his heart hammering as he dodged through the streets. He had to get to Eleanor. He had to. A gunshot rang out. Daniel ducked into an alley, chest heaving. People screamed in the distance, but he didn't stop. He ran for his life. By the time Daniel reached the apartment, Eleanor was already packing. "We have to go." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled as she stuffed their meager belongings into a bag. They found us. Daniel grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Eleanor, if we keep running, we'll never stop. Your father, he won't let this go. Tears welled in her eyes. Then what do we do? A knock on the door made them both jump. Daniel reached for a knife from the kitchen counter. He motioned for Eleanor to stay back. The knock came again, firmer this time. Then, a familiar voice. Daniel, it's Marcus. Let me in. Relief flooded through Daniel as he unbolted the door. Marcus stepped inside, his face grave. They're not gonna stop, man. You need to leave the city. Eleanor's breath hitched. But where would we go? Marcus hesitated, then said, There's a man I know. He helps people like you, people running from something. Daniel's jaw tightened. You mean the Underground Railroad? Marcus nodded. It ain't just for escaping slavery, brother. Some people still need to disappear. The weight of the moment settled over them. Daniel looked at Eleanor. If we do this, we leave everything behind. New names, new lives, no turning back. Eleanor reached for his hand. I don't care where we go, as long as we're together. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her as if the world itself was trying to rip them apart. And as the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, they prepared to vanish into the night, one last time. The cold night air clung to their skin as Daniel and Eleanor slipped through the streets of Chicago, guided only by Marcus's hurried whispers and the urgency in their own hearts. Every shadow felt like an enemy, every distant voice a threat. They had no time to waste. Marcus led them to a small house on the outskirts of the city, where an older woman named Dorothy Lane waited. She had deep-set eyes and silver-streaked hair, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the warmth of the flickering oil lamp. You're looking to disappear, she said simply. Daniel nodded. We are. Dorothy sighed, then motioned them inside. The house smelled of burning wood and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender. You'll leave before sunrise, she told them. We'll take you west, far from here, far from anyone looking for you. Daniel exchanged a glance with Eleanor, whose hand was still laced tightly in his. They had already given up so much, but this was different. This meant erasing themselves completely. Where exactly will we go? Eleanor asked. Dorothy hesitated. A farm, out past Kansas. The owner's one of us. He helps people start fresh. Daniel exhaled slowly. They had run so far already. But was there anywhere in the world they could be truly safe? Dorothy's expression softened. You two aren't the first to come through here, and you won't be the last. That night, as Daniel and Eleanor lay on a straw-filled mattress in the small attic, they held each other close, whispering promises in the dark. They would keep running. They would find a way to be free. At dawn, Dorothy handed them a bundle of clothes. Put these on, she said. No more city folk. You're travelers now, poor, looking for work. The clothes smelled of old hay and sweat, the fabric rough against Eleanor's skin. Daniel slipped into a worn-out shirt and trousers, adjusting a straw hat over his head. When they stepped outside, a wagon was waiting for them. A man with a weathered face and calloused hands sat atop it, gripping the reins of two sturdy horses. He was introduced only as Mr. Grady. You sit in the back, he said gruffly, and don't make a sound. Eleanor climbed into the wagon first, then Daniel, squeezing into the tight space between crates and sacks of grain. The wooden planks beneath them creaked as the wagon lurched forward. Hours passed in uneasy silence. The city slowly faded behind them, replaced by endless stretches of farmland and dirt roads. Eleanor clutched Daniel's hand. Do you think we'll be happy there? Daniel didn't answer right away. His thumb traced gentle circles over her palm, a silent reassurance. We'll make it work, he murmured. We always do. But their journey was far from over. At a crossroads, the wagon suddenly jerked to a stop. Daniel tensed. Through the cracks in the wooden planks, he saw them. Men on horseback, blocking the road. Eleanor's breath hitched. They weren't ordinary travelers. They were looking for someone. One of the men rode forward. You coming from the city? He asked gruffly. Mr. Grady nodded, adjusting his hat. Just making a delivery. The man peered into the wagon, eyes narrowing. Daniel held his breath. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. For a moment, it felt as if the world stood still. Then, the man spit on the ground. "Get moving," he muttered. The wagon lurched forward. It was only when the men disappeared behind them that Daniel and Eleanor allowed themselves to breathe again. They weren't safe yet, but they were still alive. Days later, they arrived at a small farm tucked away in the heart of Kansas. It wasn't much: a weathered house, a barn leaning slightly to one side, fields stretching beyond the horizon. But to Daniel and Eleanor, it was the first place that felt like it could truly be theirs. A tall man with deep brown skin and a quiet strength in his eyes met them at the front porch. His name was Isaiah Reed, and he had once been a runaway himself. Now, he dedicated his life to helping others find refuge. "You'll be safe here," he told them, "but you'll need new names." Daniel swallowed hard. His name was all he had left of his past, but his past had also nearly gotten them killed. He glanced at Eleanor. She nodded, as if reading his mind. "We're ready," she said. Isaiah studied them for a moment, then nodded. "From now on, you'll be Thomas and Anna Carter." Eleanor, no, Anna, tested the name on her lips. It felt foreign, strange, but also freeing. Isaiah led them inside, showing them a small room where they could stay. It was simple, just a bed, a wooden table, and a basin of water. But it was theirs. That night, as they lay together under a blanket, Eleanor whispered, "We made it." Daniel, Thomas, held her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We did." But deep down, he knew their past would never truly be behind them. Some secrets refused to stay buried. Months passed. Life on Isaiah Reed's farm was hard, but honest. Daniel, now Thomas Carter, learned to till the soil, mend fences, and care for animals. Eleanor, now Anna, helped in the kitchen, tended to the garden, and nursed the sick. For the first time in their lives, they lived without fear. Or so they tried to believe. One crisp autumn morning, Anna was hanging linens on a clothesline when she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the fields. A stranger. Her hands trembled as she backed away. Thomas was in the barn when she found him. "There's a man watching the farm," she whispered. His entire body tensed. Isaiah noticed their fear and stepped in. "I'll handle it." As he approached the stranger, Thomas and Anna watched from a distance. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat, his hat pulled low over his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough, unreadable. "I heard you taken people looking for a new start." Isaiah didn't answer right away. "Who's asking?" The man hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "I have a message," he said, "for a woman named Eleanor." Anna's heart stopped. Isaiah didn't turn his head, but Thomas saw his jaw tighten. "No one by that name here," Isaiah said smoothly. The man studied him. Then, he nodded slowly, as if deciding something. "If you see her," he said, "tell her that the past never really dies." Then, he turned and walked away. Anna felt her knees go weak. It was a warning, and she knew exactly who had sent it. That night, Anna sat by the window, staring at the stars. She barely noticed when Thomas came up behind her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "He found us," she whispered. Thomas didn't answer right away. "We don't know that for sure." She turned to him, eyes filled with fear. "You heard what he said. The past never really dies." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had hoped, prayed, that their old life was far behind them. But deep down, he had always known it was only a matter of time. They sat in silence for a long time. Then, Anna reached for his hand. "If it comes to it," she said softly, "I'd rather run again than lose you." Thomas shook his head. "No more running." His grip on her tightened. "We fight this time." The next day, Isaiah called them into the barn. "I have friends," he said, "people who can help if things get dangerous." But before they could make a plan, danger found them first. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Thomas, Anna, and Isaiah ran outside, just in time to see a group of riders charging toward the farm. Anna's breath hitched. They were coming. Isaiah grabbed his rifle. "Get inside. Now." But Thomas stood his ground. His hands curled into fists. He was done running. The riders slowed as they neared, dust rising in thick clouds around them. At the front was a man Thomas recognized instantly. The same man who had once threatened to tear him away from Eleanor. Samuel Whitmore. His expression was cold as steel. "You thought you could hide forever," he said, voice laced with quiet menace. Anna clutched Thomas's arm. He squeezed her hand in reassurance. Isaiah stepped forward. "This is private land," he said. "You've got no business here." Samuel ignored him. His gaze was fixed on Anna. "Your father's been looking for you, Eleanor," he said, "and he's willing to pay any price to bring you back." Anna's heart pounded. Her father, the man who had sold her off like a possession. "I am never going back to him," she said, voice trembling but firm. "I am not his daughter anymore." Samuel smirked. "That's not your choice." He motioned to his men. "Take her." The world seemed to move in slow motion. One of the riders dismounted, reaching for Anna. Gunfire rang through the air. Isaiah had fired first. Chaos erupted. Thomas lunged, slamming his fist into one of the men. Anna kicked and struggled, breaking free from the grasp of another. Isaiah fought fiercely, his rifle swinging like a club. But Samuel was a coward. He turned his horse and fled, disappearing into the night. The rest of his men, seeing their leader abandon them, quickly followed. And just like that, it was over. Anna stood frozen, breath ragged. Thomas pulled her into his arms. "It's over," he whispered. "We're safe now." Isaiah wiped the sweat from his brow. "For now." Anna exhaled shakily. She knew the past might always chase them, but tonight they had one. She turned to Thomas, eyes shining with unshed tears. "I love you," she whispered. He cupped her face in his hands. "I love you too." And for the first time in years, Eleanor, no, Anna Carter, felt truly free. Years passed. The scars of the past faded, though they never completely disappeared. But instead of living in fear, Thomas and Anna chose to live fully, without regret, without hiding. With Isaiah's guidance, they expanded the farm, turning it into a safe haven for others seeking refuge, just as he had once done for them. Travelers came and went, some staying only for a short while, others finding a permanent home. The land flourished under their care, but more importantly, so did their love. One crisp spring morning, Anna stood on the porch, watching Thomas work in the fields. The sight of him, his strong hands, his steady movements, the quiet determination in his eyes, filled her heart with something deeper than happiness. Peace. A little girl ran up to her, giggling as she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Look, Mama, I picked these for you." Anna knelt down, brushing a loose strand of hair from her daughter's face. "They're beautiful, sweetheart." Lifting her gaze, she saw Thomas watching them, a soft smile playing on his lips. He walked over, wrapping an arm around Anna as their daughter ran off again. "She looks just like you," he murmured. Anna leaned into him. "And she has your strength." For the first time in a long time, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were simply living. And after all they had endured, that was the greatest victory of all. As the wind whispered through the golden fields, Anna knew one thing with certainty. Their love had survived, and no shadow of the past could ever take that away. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this incredible journey. Thomas and Anna's story is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that withstand even the greatest hardships. We hope their story touched your heart as much as it did ours. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and share your thoughts. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you more amazing stories. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.